So thanks for everybody coming in today. We set up an hour today for a Q&A on primarily on AFFO and the report that was done by Urban Analytics. I will say I was a member of the fiscal year 2019 Spend and Affordability Committee, and the recommendation for this particular study was only to show any potential impact that AFFO would have on future out-year revenue projections. It had nothing to do with whether AFFO was positive, negative, anything like that. It was just we were using a model that was based on old numbers, and we needed to have a model that was based on new numbers so that we could understand what the revenue growth impacts in out years. So those numbers are what's been used as we move through this year. I think the committee all agreed on the out-year revenue projections that we used that were based on this already. And we've not taken any stance on anything. I think we talked last week about whether or not development covers costs, doesn't cover costs, or anything like that, and that's not what's within the purview of the committee or the guidelines of what we've been asked to do or charged to do. So we just had the small writing group session before this. Good discussion on everything that the committee talked about last week, so I'm excited about getting that draft report to everybody next week so we can have a good discussion on that and move forward. But with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Sure.
To kick off this Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good introduction. So I think there was two spending affordability committees ago, 2 years ago, when the AFFO task force was after the AFFO task force, but the proposed changes to AFFO were going through the legislative process. And I think 2 years ago, the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee were looking at that, and they made a recommendation in their report to do a fiscal impact analysis. So the county went out, did a competitive bid, interviewed 3 or 4 consultants, selected Urban Analytics. Dr. Dean Bellis is here with us. They conducted the report, I think, at last year's Spending Affordability Committee in February. Dr. Bellis presented some preliminary findings. The report wasn't finished yet. There was a preliminary presentation. The report was then completed in July, the following July of last year. There was also a presentation given to the County Council on the impact, on the results of the report. The County Council reviewed that. There was some further discussion with Dr. Bellis at a County Council when they were deliberating the increase of the school surcharge, because there's questions about the fiscal impact of that as well. So the report was issued in July, and subsequent to that, the county budget office and DPZ and the administration put together this frequently asked questions to try to summarize the results of the report. So this is, I think, in the Dropbox account. So this is really trying to, ask questions and try to present the information in a clear way. And so you can read from that. And so this is sort of a supplement to the report. And then, that's pretty much it. I think I mentioned last time during my presentation, kind of gave the rough conclusions of the fiscal impacts. Within the first 6 years, it was estimated that there would be foregone revenues of $63 million. And what foregone revenue means, it doesn't mean we're going to lose $63 million. What it does, it just basically compares the general plan, we call it the general plan scenario, which is the growth that was planned in the general plan, compares that to estimated impacts of the potential impact of the AFFO legislation. And so what we had assumed was that there would be a slowdown in residential growth compared to the general plan scenario. And then, so the net loss of revenues reflects that difference. So we're still having revenue increases. It's just compared to the general plan. There's we call it foregone revenues of $63 million over the 6 years. And then over 20 years, I think it's $152 million. And so that's outlined in the report. And Dr. Bellis' report details all the methodologies used to indicate how the calculations were done. And that was the conclusion of the report. So I think at this point, I don't know if you wanted to summarize what you're doing, and then we can answer the questions that might be.
I can start by saying it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Most of you, I think, met me last year when I came the first time. I think there's some new members, and so it's very nice to meet you. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions. I think Jeff did a very nice summary of this of the study. I want to fill that in by simply saying is we spent about a year working on this project, and to the point that we were communicating with the county and different members of county staff in different departments on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Sometimes I spoke to Jeff 2 or 3 times during the course of the day on issues that were really complex. And so we use county data. We work closely with the county to understand how each department provides services, how revenue is generated in the county, and we look closely at the projections of housing growth without AFO and with the amended AFO. And so we also had several meetings over the course of the year, either with the board or with this committee or with individual groups, and we interviewed all the department heads as well. And so we think it's a very comprehensive report. And I know, it's over 100 pages, and I know everyone's probably read the executive summary. You may have not gotten into the details of the other 100 pages.
By the way, the report is moved to Dropbox if you use it.
So I think, I think Dr. Pinch will be the best use of our time is really to answer your questions. I'm happy to give a little presentation if you like, but I think we should do question and answers and we'll jump in there.
Yeah.
Well, I have some questions. It's just a follow-up to the responses from the memo.
Thank you.
By the way, I think it's the details in the report are really done well, and I think that's why I'm able to have some questions from it. So it's well written. The first question that's there is it's not pertaining to a trend line analysis or linear regression, which are in my view completely different from what I'm asking. This is simply to say you're using county data that's available, and it's a projection for future years, but there are also county data for the previous years. So you're using 2018 as your baseline, and you're saying that that's the level of service going forward. But then I don't see why it's not possible to, let's say, because you have a 6-year and a 20-year projection, I don't see why it's not possible to start from 6 years ago or 20 years ago and use the data that's available and input those numbers, that the 90 different variables, input those numbers and say, based on these numbers, this is what I would expect to see today, which is that's a benchmark. So that's to show that it's not, at least in practice, from my experience, it's not sufficient enough to say if I input numbers in it, it will show me other numbers. It's to show if I input numbers that are relevant to the county from the previous years, I can show the numbers today, like whatever is verifiable.
That's a very good question. Thank you for clearing that up, because when I prepared the memo and I saw the comment about benchmarking, I think as an economist, I think some type of linear regression analysis so we can develop a trend and see what is the relationship of the variables as they follow along. Mm-hmm. What's the central tendency along the mean?
Yeah.
We could have done exactly what you said. I mean, as the model is set up to do that, we could have gone back 10 years or 15 years or 6 years ago and put in those variables, and we would have got findings, and we could have run the model twice and said, okay, if we had run this model in 2014 or 2012,
yes,
this is what the answer would have been.
Yes.
This is what the answer would have been, and if we ran the model in 2007, this is what the model ran in 2018. We weren't asked to do that, but it gets back, but the answer to your first question, mathematically, the model can do that. What you really said before really hits the nail on the head. It's a level of service analysis, and the level of service that, not just Howard County, but any county, anywhere in the country, any city, any town, when they provide services, public services, police, fire, ambulance, public schools, parks and recreation, they produce a level of service each year for all the residents based on what their budget is, how much tax revenue is collected, how much money they have, just like any one running a business or any household, you have salary, you have the expenses. If we did that analysis, I would have a report that said, okay, 2014, this was the answer. And this is the answer today. I'm not sure what that relevance would have been to the overall conclusion, because 6 years ago or 10 years ago, I'm not sure. I know APFO goes back a long time in the county. I just don't know how many years goes back. But you would have had different APFO scenarios 6 years ago or 10 years ago or 4 years ago. And we could have said, okay, if this scenario had taken place, this is where we'd be today. But I'm not sure from a public policy perspective, how would you as a committee benefit by knowing what it could have been 6 years ago?
It's to demonstrate that the model is capable of predicting something 20 years in advance. And this is simply a practice. This is it's just a standard of practice. It's just to, if I'm gonna build a model to say that I can predict something 20 years in advance, I have to show that I can predict something that's a known quantity. And unfortunately, I don't see where that known quantity is predicted. It increases the confidence level of the model, and it demonstrates to the reader that what I'm telling you will happen 20 years from now will happen because my model can predict what's happening today.
Right. So if we did this analysis 6 years ago, using this model, we put in the data from 6 years ago, and they'd say we'd have a prediction for 20 years. And then what I think you would want to see is how far off is the difference between that prediction or that projection if we had used numbers from 6 years ago or 10 years ago versus today. Well, there's no way to compare those numbers statistically, because part of what happens in any county is decisions are made based on current revenues each year, and those change. What's the change in the tax rate each year? What's the change in the real estate assessed values each year? What happens is if there's a national recession, as we had back in 2007, 2009. So as the variables change every year, you would have two different findings, but I'm not sure you as an analyst, if I had picked three different points, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and 15 years ago, and we compared them, we'd have 4 different 20-year projections. But how would you then say to me, which is where I'm struggling, well, which of these 4 models is more accurate? If that's what you're trying to say, I don't see how that answer can be derived.
I don't understand. So
let's say I take data from 10 years ago, and we have 2 models.
Yeah.
In 2010, the 20-year projection would have been this line. In this report, now the projection is a little bit lower. Okay, we see a difference in trend lines. Okay, and we could have run this model for 3 or 4 other periods and have all these different trend lines. I'm not sure from you or the members of this group from a public policy perspective, how would that help you to make decisions moving forward? Because at each point in time, different variables were used based on different assumptions.
Real quick, just to clarify, this is not a group that makes any public policy.
Oh,
Yes.
We're public policy is made across the hall.
Yes.
And upstairs.
but my understanding was this group is pretty influential.
This group reviews information and makes recommendations, but public policy is made across the hall upstairs. I just want everybody to be clear.
Okay.
We get to make it every 4 years.
So I'll change that from making policy to making recommendations. I'm not sure if I had run 4 different time periods in the model, we have 4 different results. How would that have helped this group to make a different recommendation?
Well, this group didn't make a recommendation on APFO at all. This group only was looking for an
I just want to use,
update.
first you public policy.
I just want to make sure we understand.
Now you're telling me
This group didn't make a recommendation on APFO, it wasn't asked to make a recommendation on APFO. All it was a discussion around, this is what out-year revenue looks like. We're going to reduce development, out-year revenue now looks like this. That was that delta, so that we don't go and say, oh, it should grow at 4%, and suddenly it's growing at 2%. And we're having discussions about expenditures and revenue. That was the only purpose of this recommendation. I just want everybody to be clear about that.
That might be the purpose, though. Unfortunately, the findings from this committee have been used to create a narrative.
These findings aren't these findings were not from this committee. Just to be clear, the committee said, we think because of the changes in legislation, there should be an updated revenue model for out-year revenue. That was it. The county hired a group to do that and has done what it's done with it, but this committee didn't recommend that anything be changed related to that or any of that. And to say that this particular study came from this committee in any more stance than...
I didn't say that. So I didn't say that. I think what
what
I said
just
was,
heard.
in the report, in last year's report, there's a table, I think, that shows that this 6-year deficit and a 20-year deficit. Anybody out there can use that and say, can create a narrative about the impact of APFO.
Certain people do create narratives.
So it's because of that, it is our responsibility to make sure that whatever is printed in the report that we publish is
Did the report say this was a...
is validated.
Did the report say that this was preliminary information?
Yeah.
But
I think we were sensitive to that because we
I
hadn't had the
think-
full report.
Yeah, I think people can selectively ignore those kinds of, that caveat, right?
But it's there. All I'm saying is it was there.
It was carefully discussed
Mhm.
that we did not have the full report. That was something that was frustrating for us as committee members to not have the full report, but at that point, it wasn't complete. So when it was the language that was there, I mean, I was satisfied that it conveyed that it was not complete.
It was presented, we
So
had some
if it was-
information.
If it was not complete, why would it be included in a report?
Why wouldn't it be?
It was
whatever-
presented.
I mean, it's obviously a factor that the year before we'd asked for an impact analysis. So to comment on it just seemed like if you read the reports, at least for the last 5 years that I've been on, there's like almost a running sequence of things that have been looked at and recommended and moving forward. So to me, that just makes sense to make mention of it.
And I think it goes with an overall statement as we continue to do, because as we've seen now, is that revenue pressure is continuing to rise. And when I say revenue pressure, I mean rise, I mean it's being compressed. And expenditures are continuing to go up. And all that we want anybody who reads the report to understand, and I think from the dialogue we've had in this room, is that we need to be paying attention to that as we make decisions today about expenditures, both from a capital standpoint and from an operating standpoint, and have an awareness of there will be impacts in the future. There are things that we don't see. There are things that we don't know are going to. Recessions don't just happen. Expansions don't die of old age. Something causes it to happen. That's going to happen. We know it's out there. If we continue to do what we did 10 years ago and spend ourselves into a recession, we're going to have some problems, and we're going to have to make significant cuts. And all we're trying to do is say, temper the growth based on where revenue projections are right now and your expenditure projections. I think that's what spending affordability is all about, not necessarily making policy decisions, just pointing out what I think a lot of people miss when you look at everything in silos.
All of
Right.
what you're saying makes sense.
Yeah.
The part that did not make sense to me was if the report is if the report was not complete, at least it would be premature to put its findings in this SAAC's report.
Okay,
It would-
I mean,
it would be-
I'll recognize that
it
that's
would
your,
be-
I recognize that, but I think the way we looked at it was, there will be an impact. There will be an impact. We all agree, right? We all agree
Yeah.
it will have a
It will-
revenue
it will-
impact, right?
It will have an impact.
So,
Yeah.
so knowing that there's a revenue impact out there, and we have some data to say that, is it inappropriate to at least share some of it, even if it says the report's not final and it's preliminary, but we know there's gonna be a revenue impact? Or would it be more appropriate to just ignore it in totality?
It would be appropriate, at least in my mind, to use a completed, the conclusions of a completed report.
It wasn't here, and we had to have a report done by the end of February.
Yeah, and then,
I mean, that's
yeah.
mandated by our charge, we have the same charge right now. I mean, we don't have the final school budget right now, it's not going to be done for a few months, but we
Yeah.
have what the preliminary school budget is, so there will be references to the preliminary school budget in the report, just like there was last year. So, I mean, everybody can take something different from it, and you know, we could always do something better. I mean, it's always a good way, we could have couched the language differently, we could have been more focused on not numbers, but there will be impact to
Sure,
revenue.
yeah.
But there was no intention
No,
of saying
that's-
of validating what the report was saying, is, other than what we're seeing is there will be revenue impact.
I think there's a danger that it's not even just a possibility. It did happen that once it was printed and once it was shared to the public, the findings were used to say that residential development pays for itself. Look at the SAAC report that used the urban analytics.
Again, but you know the SAAC report didn't say anywhere in there that residential development pays for itself.
Well,
So what people do
So people took one
individually,
thing and
right.
said, this is they've referenced it, therefore they're saying it's not what we said. It only said there will be revenue impact. There was no, I don't believe there was a statement, I can go read the report again, that residential development pays for it.
well,
Can I go
we-
back, though, because you've raised several times, and I think it's actually a legitimate point, that's the whole benchmarking of the report. But you can't take, I don't think it's fair to take your model from, I'm going to just say 2020 for purposes here, your 2020 model and go back 10 years and enter 2010 data to see if your 2020 model accurately forecasts from 2010 to 2020. Because in between 2010 and 2020, there have been all sorts of policy changes within the county, AFO changes, growth changes, revenue changes, et cetera. I don't think it's fair to expect a forward-looking study to be validated by going back 10 years.
Yeah.
Because you've got 10 years of changes to the forecast that would have been made.
Likewise, if next year, if the county were to call us back and we put in 2021 data, and then the next year after that, we come back and do 2022, in the year 2030, it's the same situation. You'd then be saying, well, I'm not sure if it's fair in 2030 to go back and look at 2020. You have different findings every year, but those findings are being affected by decisions that are made by.
After the study's complete.
That's right. This is all based on historical data.
No, I'm glad,
And
Yeah,
an
you're right.
I'm glad
example
you
of that
mentioned
is-
that.
yeah.
So, I mean,
What I was asking was not why not back calculate 2010 data. What I'm asking is, you have the model, which is not tied to any specific year. The model is not tied to any specific year. You can input, you have data from, as far back as 2000.
What he's saying is you can put in what actually happened into the model.
And
I
calculate
I'm
today.
sorry if I said that. The model mathematically is set up. You can put in any year.
Any year, yes.
Put any financial data,
That was my
any
understanding.
tax rates,
So
any
so
housing.
if you did all that and
Yeah.
plug that in for all of, or I guess, are you saying you could do 2010, but the model wouldn't allow you to put in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and all the changes that happen every year subsequent to that? You could only put in 1 year.
1 year at a time.
At a time.
Yeah.
But you probably could put in 2010, 2010 budget, 2000 population, and then the growth that happened, and see what would have happened. And so you did this 10 years to compare it to reality. Then you say, okay, it's different. You could probably go back and say, why is it different?
Right.
Oh,
What were the policies?
oh, the county council,
right.
oh, the county council raised the school surcharge. So therefore, you have greater revenue, so that sort of explains the difference. So you could do something like that. You'd have to kind of go back and figure out why there's
Be more
differences.
iterative.
Yeah, much
Yeah,
more.
yeah.
It'd be more iterative of each year,
And-
Right.
and so that,
Right.
and then from each year's findings, I could develop a trend line,
Right.
okay? But at the end of the day, you know, we came, and I know, Richard, you want to comment, but when we did the, when we came back to do the school surcharge tax analysis. Well, we have the original school surcharge tax rate in the model because that's the official rate at the time we did the model. And then I spoke to Jeff yesterday and he said, Dean, by the way, the surcharge, school surcharge tax was approved as a higher number, okay? But looking backwards, we never know, we'll never know in 2010, that in year 2020, the county's gonna decide to increase the school surcharge tax rate from $1.32 to $7.50.
Right.
Whether I did a linear regression analysis or a simulation model, we still wouldn't know that.
And this analysis actually, I think, informed the decision to raise the school surcharge.
Yes.
Because you have more information and you realize, oh, if growth is slowing, we're going to have sort of this reduced revenues. Maybe we should offset that by increasing the school surcharge. So I think that in part, these kinds of studies help the policy decisions. And that's why the school surcharge is increased. So,
So I think of our report, at least I do, as a management tool. It's something you have to help you in the course of doing your work. And I'm not gonna say what you do because I've already been corrected twice, okay? So whatever you do here, whatever you do here,
Well-informed
we
decision.
hope this report helps you to make a better informed decision.
Could you explain again, I'm sorry, why it's not possible to input actual numbers from 2010 or, you know, whatever.
Every year along the way.
It is possible.
Because, which is what you did, right? That's what you did in your model. Right now, what you did was input numbers for the future years, every year. Actual numbers.
Yes.
So why isn't it possible to do the same thing for previous years?
It is possible.
You would have,
So why wasn't that done?
Let Richard.
you would have to go back and say, in 2010, here's how the allocations of spending were, and then it wouldn't be a particularly good predictive tool because we've made, as we said, policy changes have been made. We've grown certain levels of spending above and beyond. So even if you could get all the data for 2010, because there's a lot that goes into the derivation of the model, so the year it took was involved with meeting with department heads to understand what the current allocations were. I don't know how one would do that and say you would meet with the current department head
Who wasn't here?
who wasn't here 10 years ago and say, all right, in 2010, how did the fire department spend its money on these types of calls? We'd have some of it, but not all of it. And then even if you could do that, it would be mathematically meaningless because you'd be saying, based on conditions that exist in 2010, what's happened over the following 10 years, and how did that predict it? Well, we know we predicted it somewhat accurately, but we made decisions based on policy to grow spending or grow revenues in certain areas that weren't counted in. So what this model says is based on current conditions and current projections of growth, here's what one can expect based on different scenarios. And you could go back and forecast, say, what's happened over the last 10 years based on current expenditure patterns, and it would not be bearing on reality because we've made decisions on both revenues and expenses that change the allocation.
I think the best way to evaluate any fiscal model is to look at the assumptions that went into it. So for example, we're estimating, it's detailed in the report, what is the average value of a newly built single-family detached house in Cambridge? And that was based on averages. And take a look at that number, and if you think that's too low or high, then you could adjust that number to see what where the revenue's overestimated because we estimated a house in Oakwood was going to be 100,000 more than it really is. So you can kind of look at the assumptions, and there's lots of variables, but you can probably look at the big ones because property tax is 60% and income tax is another 30%. You can look at those methodologies and say, does that make sense? Are we estimated the right amount of revenues from new construction? That way you can evaluate the assumptions going in the model. The same with the costs. Is the cost per school student seat, does that make sense? Or is Howard County spending that much currently per student? If that's correct, then you have the revenues and then you have the costs, and then you can judge the validity of the estimates that come in from the model. That's probably the best way to analyze the fiscal model rather than trying to look at history, because policies do change and things like that. But you can, you know,
Well,
you know.
that's the reason that you need to benchmark the model is because of that, because things happen, things change.
Right.
You need to make sure that what you're predicting, this affects people's lives. We have a responsibility that when we are looking at this model, that what it's saying will happen, will happen. I'm not the first person to write something about validation and verification of benchmarking. This is a standard. This is an industry standard, and it's not here. This is a basic industry standard. Any industry, whether it's engineering, whether it's the finance industry. Take me out of this because perhaps it's the messenger who's the problem. But I urge you to ask any industry expert who does model development. This is a basic requirement, and it's not here.
So is your critique then with the county who wrote the RFP that didn't include that? Or is your critique with these gentlemen who responded to the RFP?
No, the critique is that perhaps maybe that's part of the overall, maybe that's how RFPs are done. But if I come to you and I say to you, I can help you predict the future, I have to show you that I can, that can work today.
I understand your point, I mean, that's not the question. The question is, the county wrote an RFP to accomplish a specific task. These gentlemen responded to the RFP, as well as I'm sure many others. You win some,
This is all we do.
you win some, you lose some.
Yeah.
They responded to the RFP, the county reviewed all of the responses to the RFP. They decided that these gentlemen were the right people to perform the report as outlined by the RFP. I guess I don't understand, I understand your point, but I don't understand how this study can in any way be critiqued as far as their performance. If you have a gripe, you have a gripe with what the county asked them to do, not what they did, because they did what the county asked them to do.
Do you think that poor decisions were made based upon what you see as faulty data, as a faulty analysis? I mean, I think that's kind of at the core of it. Were mistakes made in the actual decision-making because of this analysis?
Okay, so let me give a different example, okay? Because we talked about RFP. Let's say we're filing taxes now, right? If I purchase a software to prepare my taxes, the RFP will not say, it should be able to file, taxes. The implied is it should be able to file the taxes according to, it should be able to file taxes properly. It should be able to calculate the taxes properly.
But it can't tell you what your taxes are gonna be in 9 years.
No,
Because the model-
So
the
what's-
model-
I think-
let's use your analogy. If you bought tax software 10 years ago, before the rates changed,
It's not gonna work.
and did the same thing you're saying. So you went to TurboTax 10 years ago and applied the TurboTax model this year from 10 years ago, it would find meaningless results because we've had tax cuts.
No, I'm,
So what, I mean,
I'm not talking about,
no,
so,
you're actually using a very good example. It's a basically derivational model of basically a spreadsheet-based model. It looks at revenues and how much do you owe based on these revenues. It's very similar in a very simplistic way to this model. And what you're saying is that if you used TurboTax from 10 years ago, you should be able to predict federal revenues per person today, and that's just
no,
not
that's
true.
that's not what I'm saying.
It
What I'm
is.
saying is if I compare 2 or 3 different tax softwares, right now, they should be able to tell me within, within, I mean, exactly, they should have the same output, right? So if I get a different tax software that, someone just said, I have this tax software, it will be able to help you file taxes, but I have not verified that it can do that. I've just programmed it, and I have an idea of how,
But that's for this year.
Yeah.
That's for this year, knowing exactly what the tax rates are this
Yes.
year. I don't expect that if I put that same, if it's the same program, hasn't changed at all, and I do it, and I use it 5 years from now, it's gonna be accurate. It's not going to be because there will have been changes in the tax structure.
I understand. I
Is
understand.
there a conclusion other than residential development doesn't pay for itself that you would accept?
I would say that, so you're saying,
Is there a conclusion that you would accept other than residential development does not pay for itself?
yeah, I don't accept the conclusion that residential development pays for itself.
Period. So all this back and forth about benchmarking, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
It's simply
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
So,
Well, based
How many-
from the report. So if you wrote the report and said, this is the result, these are the results, and based on the results, I made a conclusion that residential development pays for itself, then since the underlying analysis does not support that, I can't accept the conclusion.
But what if I don't agree with you on that?
yeah.
I mean, if you've got a complaint about the report, it seems to me it belongs at the council and at the exec's office, not here.
Well,
I mean, seriously, because we've got a lot of smart people here who wrote that RFP, people that reviewed the RFP, people that reviewed and worked all along on the report. And so, just because it doesn't come up with the conclusion that you want, it kind of suggests that all of them are not so smart. And I find that, I kind of find it offensive, actually.
Multiple firms responded.
I'm sorry, I just do.
Dean,
I
how
mean,
many of these studies
I've been
have you
trying to
done?
really listen to your points of view, and I've tried to really listen to the areas that you have concerns about. But where I get lost, frankly, is when you start projecting the future, it's always going to be inaccurate. It just is. We could have a pandemic tomorrow. You know,
That's why it's important
You know,
to make sure that when you're
you can't-
using a model to predict the
But you're
future,
asking for some sort of precision, it seems
that's
to
not
me.
what I'm asking.
Well,
And it also seems like that you're afraid that there might be an underlying political agenda in the development of the model, which I sort of reject, I mean, based on, and I'm not an economist, but I am married to a tax economist. I kind of reject that, I don't think there was a political bent in how the model was created.
This council and this executive are not biased toward development and
No.
begging you to come to them with a study that says, please show us it so that we can favor future development. Come on, that's,
Again, like those are things that are being said by people other than me. What I'm in this, as it applies to this
but
report.
that's the
but you
implication.
just
As it applies to
said, you
this
just said
report.
there's no conclusion other than
Well, you-
residential
As
development
it applies
doesn't
to
pay
this,
for itself
as it
that you would
applies to this
accept.
report, as it applies to this report, the way the conclusion is derived, because the underlying model has not been benchmarked, there's no way to
There actually, but Jeff gave you the way to do it.
Look at
You
the
have-
assumptions.
Every assumption used in the findings here are laid out in the model. As he said, revenues are based on, housing values. Incomes are based on housing values by the house. Costs are based on, allocations of spending. If you disagree with those costs and the assumptions in the model, rerun it, redevelop it. You can, it is possible. It's not because it hasn't been benchmarked, because the reasons we've laid out that benchmarking doesn't make.
So it
So
sounds
what I'm
like,
saying is, if you want to critique the model, which is certainly you're right,
what I heard
look at
was,
the assumptions in the model.
what I heard was, it wasn't benchmarked because the county did not ask for it, because it wasn't in the RFP. That's what I heard.
Well, because you asked me why didn't I do it?
So, yeah, that's,
So I was just responding to your question.
yeah, so
Right.
that's why it wasn't benchmarked.
Yeah, but I don't think the county on purpose said, don't
That,
do that.
I didn't,
Do
I
you think
mean,
it would have been more accurate to benchmark
No.
it?
No.
Okay, that's what
But I
that's what
wanna-
the
I-
question
I-
is.
I wanna
Yeah,
go back
that's
to-
basically.
I want,
it's easy to demonstrate, right?
It doesn't,
No.
it doesn't apply to this kind of analysis.
It's
And
easy,
your
I can
example-
put
I'm
the
sorry.
different years in. That's easy.
Yeah, the different years, your example of the tax software isn't correct either, because you could buy 5 different kinds of tax software, and you're gonna get a slightly different response, and when the IRS looks and audits your books, it's gonna tell you something else different, because there are assumptions underlying that. So if you think the assumptions are wrong, that's something you can look at it, but benchmarking to apply something that was written now to something 15 years ago is not gonna work. You can't do that. The economics, the projections, all of the factors, there are too many variables to be able to say that you would have accommodated every single one and been able to adjust it to make these two situations, these two scenarios identical, so the same analysis could apply. Because it's more about the assumptions than it. Benchmarking doesn't work in this kind of financial projection. It does not, it doesn't tell you anything, because there are too many variables to be able to account for that. I mean, I do this on an international scale, and no. I would never go back and benchmark the world based on 1900.
Well, the
You know, I mean, it
yeah,
doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell me anything that's useful.
A good example would be, for example, you look at the assumptions of housing values, let's say, let's say the housing values drop by 20%. What would be the impact of that on the county's revenue? Things like that, so it's really looking at the assumptions that go into the model.
so that's a sensitivity analysis.
Yes.
Right,
That's,
right.
which is different from demonstrating that the calculator is capable of producing 1 + 1 is equal to 2.
Okay, so when I wrote in the memo about the history of the model, and how this started as my doctoral research work many, many years ago, and, for anyone in the room who has a PhD, it's a rigorous academic process of developing a model. You start with a literature review, look at all the mathematical models that have developed. In my case, I went back about 100 years to around the 75 years, like around the 1930s. I looked at all the models, I looked at what were the strengths of the models, what were the weaknesses of the models. As part of my doctoral dissertation work, I developed a model that corrected for the mathematical weaknesses. Part of those weaknesses because in the 1930s we didn't have the computational power that we have today on my cell phone. You had the old abacus, 100 years ago. And so I go through a rigorous academic process. I have a committee with some very smart people on the committee. I mentioned the names of my committee members here. Do everything I need to do. As Richard and everyone else has a PhD, qualifying exams, your proposal defense, your dissertation defense, and then we tested this in counties across the country. So you're saying that all these mathematical tests to validate the mathematics of the model, which I did over a 7-year period for my dissertation work, doesn't count?
Actually, that's an important factor. That's an important aspect of the model preparation. So you develop the model, right? You input numbers in there, and it's capable. You demonstrate that it's capable of giving you an output, right? So that's a generic, that's the generic process. Then you would demonstrate that generic model is capable of is applicable to the specific jurisdiction.
Yes,
And so that particular aspect is what I believe is missing here. Because
the findings of this study will not be the same if I did this study in San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York.
Yes.
Because each jurisdiction has their own spending patterns,
Yes.
their own tax rates, their own revenue growth. So unless there's another county which is identical to Howard County somewhere in the United States, that's how I would benchmark this. But from my understanding is Howard County, and correct me if I'm wrong, is probably the most affluent county in Maryland.
It's the most affluent in Maryland and the fourth wealthiest in the county.
Okay, so I have to look to the other 4 counties in the country, the other 3, or the top 4. And then I gotta look at all the variables of those counties. And that one county may be Westchester, New York, the other one is Marin County, California. Then I gotta look at the housing structure, look at the tax rates, look at all the variables, all right? And unless they are exactly identical, which is what benchmarking is, you have to compare something to see if it's working, right? Unless these counties are identical, we will have 4 different answers. So this model is designed to take local data. We don't use national data. We don't use regional data. We look data to the specific jurisdiction.
So how do we know that?
Because how do we know that?
Yeah.
Because one, I wrote in the report the methodology, and then 2, working with
What numbers are we looking at to prove that it's specific to Howard County?
Oh, so I started off this presentation by saying we worked for a year with the county. I interviewed all the department heads. I used county data.
That's the approach. I'm talking about what results are we looking at to demonstrate that it's specific to Howard County?
The results are in the, you see the results in the executive summary, and then you see the results in all the appendix tables.
I know that's the projection. I'm talking about, you said this is applicable to Howard County. How do we know that it's applicable to Howard County?
Because I use Howard County data.
So for example, we know how much Howard County is spending on public school students, and we know how many public school students are enrolled in Howard County schools as of 2018. So then you could determine the cost the county spends per public school student. It's really not that complicated in terms of the model. It's just adding and subtracting and dividing and multiplying. So it's like, okay, so then you have a cost per student, and then you come up with the assumption, okay, we're gonna have a new single-family house built in the future. We get data from the public school system, how many typical students live in a house, single-family detached, and we actually did it in, I think, 5 different areas of the county because the rates might be different.
And that's what the school system does.
Yeah.
It collects the data
Yeah,
that way and looks
so
at it.
then we have that. Now, if that changes in 5 years,
Then it changes.
it changes. We can't control it.
Yeah.
So the data really is pretty clear in the report. And then if there's questions about the results, the question has to come from the data. So if we look at the school system data and say, well, we think there's more kids per house than this, then that could be looked into. But all of the assumptions that go into the results are done through that methodology.
So Dr. Bella said that the model is applicable only to Howard County, right?
The findings.
The findings.
The
Findings.
model is applicable to any, so you can use the model in any county.
There's 3,000 counties in the country. I can use it in all 3,000 counties.
But you plug in local variables.
I plug in the local
variables,
data.
yeah.
So the answer will not be the same unless I had 2 counties or 3
Yeah.
counties that are purely identical to Howard County. And I've never seen that for any, whether I'm looking at the city of Alexandria or the,
Everyone here could tell you there is nothing like Howard County. It's our own.
I'm not, sir, I'm not trying to be argumentative, all right? I'm not trying to give our time. I think in hindsight, all my contact information is in the report. If you had called me 3, 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, I would have come up here and had a one-on-one conversation. I would have gone through every single calculation. I would have gone through the report. I'm an open book. I wrote in my response to the RFP, there's no black box modeling. And in this report, I outlined, described the methodology. It's all an open book. And I met with all the department heads. I get the financial data from the county, work closely with Holly, work closely with everyone else. And we're using county data, so If you come back and say, well, we really don't have 2.3 students living per house, well, that's what the school department tells, whatever that number is, the school department tells me that. So maybe they're doing something wrong, but I get the data from them.
But they get county data too. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Right.
mean, they're not collecting it themselves, but sometimes they verify.
That's right, so maybe they went through and there's really 2.2 children per house, and they wrote 2.3. The county's saying, we've done our analysis, I have to trust the county.
Well, the school data comes from the school system. We
Yeah.
don't- Yeah, we don't.
I mean,
But no, but the yields and stuff like that,
Come
that,
from the school system.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. But they're getting base data from wherever they live.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I ask a question that's not on this point, but on current proposed legislation? I believe it's CB1. Councilperson Walsh wanted to extend the period from originally 7, I think it was down to 5, if I'm correct, in the last amendment? It was 5?
Yeah.
And-
Well, original was 4 years.
I know, and, but then
Then
she,
it got up to 7,
but
and
then
then
she
came back down.
brought it up to 7, and I think the amendments got it to 5. And is that something that we should give some consideration to in this report, is what the implications of 5-year versus 4-year would be? I don't know. I assume that it would have implications.
Well, yeah, I mean, so, as I said, and I like to use the word sensitivity analysis, whether you want to call it sensitivity analysis or you want to try different data, however you want to do it, we can go back into the model and plug in different
I'm
data
wondering, yeah.
points. Right, so.
And I didn't know if that's something, and this is my first year on the committee, so that's a caveat, if that's something that would traditionally sort of we would put in this to say, if this were to pass.
I don't want to speak for Steve, but I
Yeah,
think
no,
I'll
no, no.
echo what Steve said earlier. We're just simply trying to say
Right.
whether or not this is going to impact out-year revenue
Exactly.
forecast.
No, that's,
I don't think as a committee, we're engaged in deciding that a 3, 4, 5, 10 infinite
I
is good
understand that.
or bad.
Right,
So
I
I
get
think
that.
from the purposes of this committee, I would suggest that we not weigh in on that, because we're simply saying it has an impact, and we need to build that impact into the
Into our
long-term.
Projection.
You know, we don't know if it's 1%, 5%,
no,
million
I'm not
percent, and we don't
suggesting a
care.
specific number, but I am suggesting some comment as to what the impact, the negative impact on revenue,
So we are building that in.
Into
Pending
the-
legislation, it hasn't passed, so.
as APFO, right?
So we are mentioning
Right,
that
as APFO was.
the smaller committee that's starting with the draft report that the whole committee will look on is coming up with that. But clearly, because Dean set up a model that is flexible and reusable by the county, if there are issues that the county needed or wanted to run through it, that can be done. But I don't think that's our committee's,
Okay. It was just a question, is that,
and I'm just giving an opinion of one guy
No,
on
I
the committee
agree.
because Steve isn't
I
here.
didn't know if there needed to be some, at least mention of it, that an analysis would have to be done, there might be a,
I don't think we want to ask for any more analysis.
But we did.
but to the extent that it informs policy making, which is what this is meant to do. It's just meant to be information that helps to give them the background they need to make, and hopefully the public, although I don't think the public uses this as much as perhaps it should.
But Joan, we did put into the reports in previous years, and even the committee voted as a whole, that while this is the projection for this, we're recommending you stay here because there are factors on the horizon which we can't completely factor in yet.
Okay.
So there is language to that effect that the committee as a whole agreed to in terms of our growth percentage of whether, not 1.93, but we looked at 2.3 is the average, and we voted last time to say stay at 2.
Okay.
So that's the kind
I was
of-
just throwing it
no,
in the
but that's
pot
the
to
kind
say,
of-
should we
but
consider
that's
that?
the kind of thing you do in order to temper your recommendation, saying this is what the average data says, but we're concerned by other factors, and we would advise that you use this number in going forward. And that's the way you do it without saying all,
I wasn't
elucidating every one of the things that might impact,
Yeah,
So we do that.
But since it's already on the table, that's the only reason I brought it up, is that it's already on the
But
table.
we didn't do it on this until it actually existed and there was something on which
Okay,
to actually
that's,
base.
okay, cool.
Since it's 10 o'clock, I want to, for time's sake, does anybody else have a quick question? Dean, would you mind to stay a little bit after that? If people have, I have a question I want to do off.
No one's gonna eat it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.